Hello Marvel fans, my name is Francis and welcome to my channel. Let me tell you, my hype is through the roof for many of the upcoming Marvel video games for this year and beyond, especially for Insomniac's Wolverine. For me, that is going to be my most anticipated game for whatever year it is eventually able to come out. However, there's one big piece of news that has occurred over the past few months in the games industry, and that's the announcement that Microsoft is going to be acquiring Activision Blizzard along with all their subsidiary studios, which includes the likes of Treyarch, Radical Entertainment, High Moon Studios, Beanox, Raven Software, and more. The reason why this news is bothering me in relation to Marvel Games is because those studios that Microsoft will soon own, they made a multitude of Marvel games that a lot of fans are desperate to see come back. So it begs the question, will this deal make it easier for Marvel Games and Activision to cooperate on making some of the older Marvel games backwards compatible on modern Xboxes, especially when you consider that Microsoft will essentially be Activision's parent company when the deal is finalised in June of next year? At this current point in time, we can safely say that the chances of any Activision Marvel games from the past coming back is a solid zero, no chance. Mainly because Microsoft revealed that the last batch of back compat games we did receive in November was done with the intention that it was going to be the final batch we did receive, as they've currently reached the limits of acquiring the license to get these games back on the Xbox store. Don't get me wrong, I'm extremely happy with the last batch of back compat games we did receive in November. The people at Xbox should really be commended for their hard work and efforts, as thanks to them, we have nearly every single Star Wars game for the Xbox and Xbox 360 now playable on the Xbox Series S and X, along with the Max Payne trilogy, the Dead Space trilogy, and so much more. It just shows their dedication to games preservation. If Microsoft thinks the Xbox team's efforts would be better spent doing other things, instead of trying to add new games to the backwards compatibility program, then that's fine. But there is a part of me that wants to remain optimistic that they will reconsider and change their mind once the acquisition is done, because surely them purchasing Activision is going to renew their ability to acquire the licenses to get further games backwards compatible. And I don't just mean that in terms of older Marvel video games. Raven Software made their own Wolfenstein game back in 2009, so once they own that studio, surely they have all the parties needed to get that game relisted and made backwards compatible. I know that's just an assumption on my end, and trust me, I know there are a plethora of legal barriers and obstacles, especially in relation to Activision's Marvel games. If they ever wanted to sell these games again, they're gonna have to make a deal with each other. Hopefully one that wouldn't give Activision sole exclusivity over Marvel's characters in video games, and trust me, no one wants that to happen again. I just want to be able to play some of these older Marvel games on my Xbox Series X. And I feel that going to Microsoft and asking for their help to make these games backwards compatible is currently the best way to do this. Now I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, Francis, why do you want these games backwards compatible? Surely you'd rather a remaster. Well, given Activision's track record of how they handled the Marvel Ultimate Alliance ports back in 2016, no. We know they were planning to do the same thing for Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions and Edge of Time, but Marvel turned them down, and that was probably a good thing. I don't think Marvel would really appreciate them porting the game cheaply and then all of a sudden discovering, oh, these games are actually missing some DLC that should have been in there from the get-go. You know, they already had to deal with that embarrassment with Marvel Ultimate Alliance 1, and I feel so bad for whoever at Marvel Games had to get on the phone to Activision and tell them, please sort this out. It's embarrassing. It's also important to remember that Activision has a very negative reputation at the moment, and a lot of people in the industry are going to have their eyes on Microsoft to see if they can turn it around and obviously get rid of Bobby Kotick and any other individuals that work at these studios that are making them not great places to work at. So Marvel should definitely at least wait until those controversies are dealt with. But before I go over what specific Marvel games I would like to see brought back through backwards compatibility, I'm going to explain why I prefer this method over a basic remaster. When Xbox or Xbox 360 games are made backwards compatible, they essentially emulate the original game code. Any boosts to resolution or frame rate, or even the addition of Auto HDR, are done through the emulator on Microsoft's end. So there's no real need to go back to the original developers of these games and get them to enhance it. That can be done through Microsoft. Also, there's the bonus of if you already own these games physically, what your Xbox One or Xbox Series X will do is once you insert the disc, it will download a digital version of that game to your Xbox. It essentially reads the disc to acknowledge you have the right to play that game. So that means you can basically play these games regardless of the amount of scratches they have, so long as they're not majorly severe ones, like there's no shards coming off or anything like that. Plus there's also the addition for Marvel and Microsoft to essentially sell these games again, relist them so that people that missed out on these games originally can play them for the first time. I'm personally lucky because I still own my 360, and some of the older Marvel games I can still play if I just insert the discs into that. But there are some games I own, like the first two X-Men Legends games. Not only are my copies badly scratched, but they're also not playable on the Xbox 360 due to the fact they're not backwards compatible. So they're essentially locked to the original Xbox and can't be played unless you own an original Xbox. So let's talk hypothetically. If Marvel Games and Xbox were to get into discussions about making some of the older games backwards compatible, which franchise would be the best place to start? And keep in mind, I'm not an industry insider. This is just basically me having a lot of wishful thinking and having assumptions that are somewhat researched as best I can, because there's definitely probably some legal or technical constraints that even I'm not aware of. But given the fact that Disney/Marvel now owns the X-Men and the Fantastic Four in their entirety now due to the 20th Century Fox acquisition, maybe there's a tiny % chance we could see the return of X-Men Legends 1 and 2, X-Men Next Dimension, all the Fox movie games, which includes the likes of X-Men 2 Wolverine's Revenge, X-Men the Official Game, X-Men Origins Wolverine, and yeah, the Fantastic Four Activision movie game from 2005. X-Men Destiny is a little bit harder to tell if it could come back because of the whole controversial lawsuit between Epic Games and Silicon Knights. Basically, Epic won the lawsuit against Silicon Knights, forcing further physical copies of X-Men Destiny to be recalled and destroyed. But even then, Microsoft were able to bring back a previous game made by Silicon Knights called Too Human and just basically put it on the Xbox store for free, although that probably helps because Microsoft was also the publisher of that game, so who knows. Now, given those games I just mentioned, you're probably thinking, okay Francis, X-Men Legends 1 and 2 and X-Men Origins Wolverine, they are definitely worth bringing back, but the others, not so much, aren't they mediocre games? And sure, I understand that mindset, but to be honest, I don't think the initial reception of these games when they came out is really that much of a big deal. Like, just looking at some of the games that are already backwards compatible on the Xbox store, there are some that were either considered mediocre or terrible when they initially came out, like Star Wars The Force Unleashed 2, and even Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City, yet they're still on the store because it's important to preserve them regardless of their quality. Plus, I kind of have a soft spot for X-Men 2 Wolverine's Revenge. It does do a couple things better than Origins Wolverine. Like, it has a much better selection of unlockable comic book costumes. The story of the game not actually being tied to the Fox films is kind of a benefit. Sure, there are plot points in the game that ultimately go nowhere, but to me, this game has my favourite rendition of the Weapon X breakout in any X-Men or Wolverine video game to date. And yes, we know the gameplay has its problems in places, but when the stealth does work, some of those kill animations are really satisfying to pull off. But I will admit, while the reception of these games I don't think really matters that much, what matters is will they be profitable enough once they can get them back up. You know, it'd be a shame for Microsoft and Marvel to go through the effort to put these games up for sale digitally again, but if they're not making any money, then it might not be worth the effort to bring all of them back. I will say they definitely need to bring back X-Men Legends 1 and 2 if given the chance. Without either X-Men Legends games, we wouldn't have Marvel Ultimate Alliance 1, 2 or 3. It's important to preserve those games because they're the precursor to that franchise. So if any X-Men game does get salvaged, I hope it's these two. Moving on from X-Men and the Fantastic Four, I think it's time to talk about the Mickey Mouse of Marvel himself, my favourite superhero, Spider-Man. Of course I love what Insomniac have done with the character, but I'm not going to ignore the history that Spider-Man has had on the Xbox and Xbox 360, and I still believe there's a chance they can bring back a few of the Activision Marvel Spider-Man games from the past, regardless of Marvel's relationship with Sony. Now, many people tend to get confused by the fact that because the Insomniac Spider-Man games are exclusive to PlayStation and Spider-Man's content in Marvel's Avengers can only be played on PlayStation, it's led people to believe that Sony owns the video game rights to Spider-Man, when in actuality that is not true. As far as we know, Sony only owns the film rights to Spider-Man. Now, it's entirely possible Sony and Marvel could have made a deal to make Spider-Man exclusive to PlayStation on consoles going forward, possibly during the time when Marvel Studios and Sony Pictures were renegotiating to try and keep Tom Holland's Spider-Man in the MCU, but we don't know that for sure. No major news outlet has been able to confirm that such a deal relating to Spider-Man video games even exists, and I highly doubt that Marvel would relinquish the video game rights to Spider-Man just to keep Tom Holland in the MCU. Now you're probably thinking, but even if Sony doesn't own the video game rights to Spider-Man, surely they must have some influence over Marvel games as to what they can and can't do with Spider-Man. And true, they might have a little bit of influence. If Marvel Games ever wanted to make older Spider-Man games backwards compatible, the only games I could see Sony potentially being able to stop are the movie tie-in games, which there are 6 in total. Yes, Friend or Foe counts as one because it's marked as a Columbia Pictures movie licensed game that uses the character designs from the Raimi Spider-Man films. As it stands, only one of these movie licensed games is backwards compatible on Xbox Series X and PS5, and that's The Amazing Spider-Man 2, due to the fact that Microsoft and Sony have done a much better job of bridging the gaps between console generations in regards to making sure your older library of video games can be brought over to the next console. But Amazing Spider-Man 2 is only backwards compatible provided you have the physical disc, as it was delisted along with every other Spider-Man game back in 2014. But the important thing is, if Marvel and Microsoft were to make the movie Spider-Man games backwards compatible, they would need further approval from Columbia Pictures, which is a subsidiary studio to Sony. And I get the feeling that Sony would be inclined to say, no, you are not allowed to relist and resell these games on Xbox, because it would clash with Sony's strategy to have Spider-Man associated with the PlayStation brand. You know, whenever there was a trailer for Spider-Man No Way Home, somewhere there would be a small little advert for maybe some PS5 products or, hell, Insomniac Spider-Man games. Because they want to encourage the idea in people's minds that if you want to play the latest solo Spider-Man game, then PlayStation is the console to do it on. But I don't think that sort of influence can encompass every Spider-Man game that Activision made in the past. Ask yourself this: what could Sony possibly do to stop Marvel Games and Xbox from making Ultimate Spider-Man, Spider-Man Web of Shadows, Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, and Spider-Man Edge of Time backwards compatible on Xbox Series S and X? You know, all 4 of those games have no association with Columbia Pictures or Sony Interactive Entertainment in regards to licensing or publishing duties. The answer is probably nothing. It could in fact be a technicality that Marvel and Xbox could exploit to make them playable again. Some people are probably thinking right now, well, that's stupid, it's not worth the risk. Sony might take Tom Holland out of the MCU, or cancel Marvel's Spider-Man 2, or Marvel's Wolverine for that matter. I mean, come on, that is a bit extreme, and a massive overreaction if Sony were to retaliate like that. Especially when you consider that if they made those games backwards compatible and relisted them, they would only be able to make money off them through digital sales, and as much as we want these games to return, they're not going to overshadow any of Insomniac's upcoming games. I imagine they'd be sold quite cheaply as well because they're old Xbox and Xbox 360 games. Plus, it's important to remember that while Sony and Marvel have their relationship, if Marvel wants to do something with Spider-Man that does not concern Sony, they're more than capable of finding loopholes around them. Going slightly off topic in terms of video games, but still on topic because it's Spider-Man, Marvel owns the television rights to Spider-Man. They've made multiple Spider-Man cartoon shows that do not concern Sony at all, and naturally, with Disney Plus, Marvel and Disney are gonna want their own Spider-Man content to come to that service, especially MCU Spider-Man content. Take the character's appearance in the Marvel Zombies episode of What If, for example. The reason Spider-Man's character design in What If wasn't one-to-one with Homecoming was so they could freely use the character however they wanted to. They don't want to go to Columbia Pictures and have to ask them for permission to use the Homecoming suit when they own the television rights. Instead, Marvel and Disney using their Disney Parks attraction character design of Spider-Man is a loophole that gets them around a minor obstacle in relation to Sony. Last thing I'll say about making those 4 Spider-Man games backwards compatible. Even if they can't relist them and sell them again, surely Marvel can at least give Microsoft the permission to at least make them backwards compatible for people that already own these games. Take one of the last games that got added to the backwards compatibility program recently. 50 Cent Blood on the Sand is a game I imagine has a ton of licensing and legal obligations that would prevent it from being relisted, but somehow Xbox managed to get that game backwards compatible without the need to relist it. It's these sort of strange behind the scenes interactions that Xbox have gone through that still give me hope that we could see some of my favourite Spider-Man games playable again on modern Xboxes. Next up is Hulk, and this is a bit of a tricky one because yes, Radical Entertainment did make 2 Hulk games back in the 2000s, but Activision were not the original publisher of those games. That was Vivendi Universal Games and Sierra Entertainment. However, later on, along with Radical Entertainment being bought by Activision, Vivendi Games and Sierra Entertainment also merged with Activision. Now, obviously, a lot of what I'm saying is conjecture, but hopefully we can at least get Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction back because most of the publishers are with Activision technically. The Ang Lee movie Hulk game might be a bit more difficult to bring back because obviously Universal Pictures, it's a game based on their iteration of the Hulk and they may or may not approve it. Who knows? Obviously Hulk Ultimate Destruction needs to come back because not only is that the best Hulk game currently ever made, but it's also the precursor game to Radical Entertainment's own prototype game series, which, speaking of which, because Microsoft will also be inheriting that IP, maybe it would be a good idea to make the original 360 versions of Prototype 1 and 2 backwards compatible. You know, multiple publishers have released remasters of some of their fan favourite games, but at the same time they've also made them available through backwards compatibility on Xbox. Ubisoft have done this, 2K have done this, and even EA of all publishers have done this. And it's good that they do this because sometimes a remaster will come out, but then you take a look at it and go, actually, I kind of prefer how the original version looked and played compared to this remaster. But besides Hulk and Prototype, Radical Entertainment also made a couple of Crash Bandicoot games back in the late 2000s. Look, I'm not a huge Crash Bandicoot fan, I haven't really played any of the games, so I can't speak to the quality of the games not done by Naughty Dog or Toys for Bob. But I'm sure those games in between Crash Bandicoot 3 and the Insane Trilogy have their fans. And some of those games are still purchasable on the Xbox 360 marketplace today. And with the knowledge that Microsoft will soon own the Crash Bandicoot IP, it just makes me think if you're not going to bother giving those games the remaster treatment like the Insane Trilogy, then you might as well try and make them backwards compatible for the fans that still want to play those games. The last 3 Marvel games I extensively want to talk about are the first 2 Marvel Ultimate Alliance games and Deadpool. And those 3 games are a little bit tricky due to the fact that because they have ports for the PS4 and Xbox One, that technically makes them cross-generation games. So it's about Marvel, Activision and Xbox going through their options and seeing, okay, well, which is the best way to relist these games? Do we just re-release their ports and maybe enhance them further for Xbox Series X and S? Do we make the 360 versions of these games backwards compatible, in which case that means they'll also have to relist their DLC add-on packs? Which that issue extends to a lot of the other Marvel games. If we want Shattered Dimensions and Edge of Time back, their skin packs also need to be relisted, along with X-Men Origins Wolverine's challenge map as another example. You know, if they made the base versions of Deadpool and Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2 on Xbox 360 backwards compatible, fans would complain that their DLC packs are missing unless they go through the extra work to bring them back up. But you never know, there's always the option of maybe they relist both the 360 version and their ports for Xbox One. If just the base version of Marvel Ultimate Alliance 1 went backwards compatible, your character select screen would look something like this, where the game constantly reminds you that you cannot buy all 8 DLC characters. However, I do believe I've thought of a way they can work around this issue for Marvel Ultimate Alliance 1. If you're someone like me who couldn't wait to play MK9 Complete Edition on Xbox Series X when it finally went backwards compatible, you may remember there were problems with the emulator not recognising the game as the Complete Edition disc. Now, eventually this issue did get fixed, and thank God for that, because it kept recognising the disc as the base version of the game, meaning you couldn't access any of the DLC content. But in the case of Marvel Ultimate Alliance 1, I'm just thinking, well, maybe there's a way to configure the emulator so regardless whether or not you put in the Marvel Ultimate Alliance 1 base disc or the Gold Edition disc, it will still read it as the Gold Edition disc, meaning you get access to all the DLC content regardless. I know this idea might piss people off because I'm also one of those people that bought Marvel Ultimate Alliance 1 and 2 when they were ported in 2016, so I do understand the feeling of being mugged off, like, oh, if I just waited until they made it backwards compatible, I wouldn't have wasted 45 quid on those cheap ports. But at the same time, that was a long time ago, and I'm perfectly fine with owning that port and a 360 version if it did go backwards compatible. So that's pretty much all my thoughts on how and why they could make these games backwards compatible again. But I do want to make a few things clear before I end this video. I do want to stress the fact that even if Marvel, Activision and Xbox were to get through these absolute ridiculous licensing nightmare obstacles, we have no idea how they would run technically. You know, I'm sure the team at Xbox would test these games intensively to make sure they run well, but the fact that they can't change the original source codes of these games is also a constraint in itself. Yes, they can enhance these games through the emulator, but it's not guaranteed for every single one of these games. Some of these games might not be able to get a frame rate boost if there is already an FPS cap in place. Sure, some of the original Xbox games could get a 4K boost in resolution, but if they're limited to a 4:3 aspect ratio, it wouldn't be a full 4K boost. The games would still look sharper, but it wouldn't be a full 4K due to the lack of widescreen support. This doesn't personally bother me, as I've just recently finished Star Wars Jedi Outcast and the original Max Payne through backwards compatibility, and I still enjoyed them regardless of the lack of widescreen support. But I also understand why it might be off-putting to other people as well. Also, it would be great if a lot of these games did get auto HDR support, as a lot of these games didn't initially have that feature. And for those that don't know, HDR is essentially enhanced colours on 4K TVs. I'm not much of a big tech expert on this subject, but I do understand that one of the major reasons holding back older games from getting auto HDR support is that enabling the feature might make some older games unpleasant to look at. If I had to make a guess as to which Marvel game might not receive auto HDR support, it would be Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. As not only is that game already quite bright and colourful, but if you play through the Spider-Man Noir levels and turn on your spider sense, it adds a black and white filter over the screen, and with HDR on top of that, that might make the game look incredibly bright and blinding to the player. Possible tech constraints aside, I do want to emphasise that I hope this video does not come across as an entitled Xbox fanboy trying to spark some console wars, because I genuinely don't care about that. I just want these older Marvel games preserved, and who knows, maybe this could be the start of Marvel and Activision working to get some of their older games back through other means. You know, I loved Neversoft's original Spider-Man game for the PlayStation 1, and if they were to salvage as much of the Xbox Marvel games as much as they could, maybe they can move on to making some of these older games available on PC, or in the case of Neversoft Spider-Man, make that available through GOG and include it on the Nintendo Switch's online service. Microsoft have a good working relationship with Nintendo, so there's always the possibility that could happen. And in regards to PlayStation, I know it's my theory that Columbia Pictures would not allow the older Spider-Man games to come back, but you never know, they might surprise us. They might say, okay, you can sell them again as long as we're able to as well. There's always that possibility. Like, Xbox are still allowing further entries in Call of Duty to be playable on PlayStation, despite the fact they're going to be owning Activision soon, but I do think Xbox is going to be the best place to start to bring these games back. And sure, Microsoft could always triple down on this, saying, no, we're not adding any more backwards compatible games, but I can't help but feel that, to me, backwards compatibility is my favourite feature of the Xbox Series X. And I genuinely believe it is worth going through all this ridiculous effort one final time. Even if the number of games they bring back is not as close to 76, it's still worth considering trying again once Microsoft fully owns Activision. So yeah, that's the end of the video. And yeah, if you couldn't tell, I pretty much embody the meme of person gets brand new console, ends up playing older games rather than new ones. But before I go, I want to leave you with this final message. If you own an Xbox 360 and still have some of your saves for your older Marvel games, do yourself a favour, turn it back on and transfer that data to the cloud storage on your 360, as you never know, you might one day thank me in the future. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe if you want to. Leave a comment down below if you want to share your thoughts on Marvel games from Activision becoming backwards compatible in the future. For now, we just play the waiting game. My name's Francis, and I hope I hear from you all soon. Bye all.